Chilling tales for dark nights.
Want to make sure you never miss a Chilling Tales for Dark Nights video again? Be sure to subscribe and hit that bell to turn on notifications. The following program is a production of Chilling Entertainment and the creative team at Chilling Tales for Dark Nights, and a proud member of the Simply Scary Podcasts Network. Visit simplyscarypodcast.com to learn more about this and our other weekly storytelling programs. Thank you for listening and enjoy the show.
Good evening. I'm storyteller Otis Jiry, and I ain't your grandfather. From where I'm from, we don't do bedtime stories. And if that's what you were expecting, you're in the wrong place. If it's terrifying tales you're after, well then, I've got just the thing. Get comfortable, settle in, turn off the lights, if you dare. Your night is about to get a whole lot darker. Who needs sleep anyway?
Good evening, friends, and welcome to another edition of Scary Stories Told in the Dark. I'm your host, Otis Jiry, and tonight we're not chasing what lurks in the shadows. We're paying attention to what stays behind. Things you try not to notice. The ones that wait, watch, and linger. Sometimes it's a figure at the edge of your vision. Sometimes it's a voice that shouldn't know your name. But when something follows you home without footsteps, you start to wonder if you'll ever leave it behind to begin with. And joining me, as always, is the man who knows better than to look twice, the one and only Malcolm Blackwood.
Thanks, Otis. You know, tonight's stories aren't about what jumps out at you. They're about what waits. 5 tales of strange presences, faded warnings, and creeping dread. We've got woods that whisper, memories that echo, and entities that don't need to chase you because they're already inside the room.
So settle in, friends, turn down the lights, and don't worry if you feel something watching from the hallway. Some things, they just take their time. Before we let the quiet things creep in, a quick word to our loyal listeners. If you want your horror uninterrupted, ad-free, and ready whenever you're brave enough to listen, we've got something for you.
Join our patrons area for just $7.99 a month, or save with an annual plan. You'll get full-length episodes, early access, and an entire archive of Simply Scary Network programming. That's hundreds of hours of horror on demand.
Just visit simplyscarypodcast.com and click on Patrons. You'll be whisked away to chillingtalesfordarknights.com, where the nightmares never sleep.
Support indie horror, unlock the vault, and keep the darkness alive.
Now then, let's get to the stories that don't leave. Welcome to Things That Linger. Our first tale tonight introduces us to a brother and sister who escaped to a family cabin forgotten in the Adirondacks. But what they find beyond the tree line isn't safety. It's a silent presence moving along the fence, watching, guiding, herding. This is The Grey Herders by Laurel Veitch, performed by yours truly, Otis Jiry. Part 1. Came to the cabin after everything else had fallen apart. Not for a vacation, and not because we wanted to live a simpler life. It was the only option left. My aunt had owned the place decades ago, back in the 70s, when she and her partner still believed in living off the land. She died before I was born, and the cabin sat untouched ever since. When my mother began unraveling, first in small, barely noticeable ways, then rapidly and completely, there was nowhere else for us to go. My father had already left, CPS was circling, the hospital had recommended long-term psychiatric care, and the court agreed. So I took my little brother and brought us here, past the last postal route, beyond the edge of cell service, to the place where roads narrowed and the world seemed to forget your name. The cabin had no modern conveniences beyond a rusted generator and a couple of rain barrels hooked up to an old hand pump. There was no plumbing, no Wi-Fi, no promise of help if something went wrong, but it had a roof and 4 walls, and after the last 2 weeks we'd spent drifting from bored couches to cheap motels, that was enough. Tyler called it our tree fort with a fireplace. I didn't correct him. If it gave him comfort to imagine this place as an adventure, I wanted him to have that. He didn't bring up Mom, not at first. I believe he understood more than he let on, even if he couldn't explain it. Instead, he wandered through the trees, collected dead insects, and pointed out every bird he saw. He was 10 years old, and he was good at pretending things were fine. I was 17, and I knew they weren't. Still, we had quiet, and for a time that felt like enough. The fence revealed itself one afternoon as we explored the rear edge of the property. It emerged from the brush, partially overtaken by brambles and creeping ferns, and extended in both directions until it vanished behind the trees. It stood 6 feet tall and was topped with twisted barbed wire, the posts leaning just enough to suggest age. When the wind fell still, the structure seemed to emit a faint hum, almost like a low electric whine embedded in the silence. There were no signs of markings, nothing to indicate who had built it or what it was meant to contain or keep out. Tyler asked if it was supposed to stop people from coming in or to stop something from getting out. I told him it was probably part of an old military boundary. We were just north of the abandoned airbase ruins, and the Adirondacks had always been a patchwork of forgotten government land. He liked that explanation. It made the place sound mysterious, maybe even important. From that day forward, Tyler spent most evenings near the fence. He never got close enough to touch it, I made sure of that, but he would carry a small folding stool into the underbrush and sit just within sight of it, as though waiting for his show to start. One night, while I was gathering dry wood near the tree line, he called out to me. "Did you hear that?" he asked. I glanced up. "The humming?" "No," he said. "Them." I paused, turning toward him. "Who?" He pointed across the fence to where the trees grew densely enough to block most light, even before the sun dipped. The underbrush was thick there, tangled with vines and broken branches, and shadows collected early. "There are people out there," he said. "They walk back and forth, always at the same time." I stared into the forest, but saw nothing. "You're imagining things." "I'm not," he replied. "They're tall. Taller than Dad. They don't talk. They just walk. And sometimes they stop and look at me." What unsettled me wasn't the content of his words, but the calm, factual tone with which he delivered them. He didn't sound frightened or even particularly curious, just observant. I told him to stop sitting out there alone, that he was letting his imagination get the better of him. He agreed, but the next day I found him in the same spot, quietly watching. At first I dismissed it as an overactive mind. Out here, surrounded by silence and stripped of modern distractions, thoughts had a way of echoing louder than usual. It was easy to imagine figures in the trees, or to mistake the wind for footsteps. Even I'd experienced it, brief flickers of motion at the edge of vision, fleeting glimpses of pale shapes just beyond certainty. And then one evening, I saw them. It was just after dark. I had stepped outside to shake out a blanket when something caught my eye near the tree line. The air still held that lingering early summer chill that tightened the skin. Tyler was inside with a flashlight and one of the weathered Hardy Boys paperbacks we'd found in the attic. I approached the porch railing, squinting toward the fence. 3 shapes stood motionless beyond it, spaced evenly apart, no more than 20 yards away. At first I assumed they were trees or fallen logs illuminated by the moonlight, but I'd been out earlier and hadn't seen them then, and the silhouettes didn't match. Each figure was roughly man-shaped, but wrong in proportion. Too tall, too thin, with hunched shoulders and elongated necks. Their features were indistinct, as if smeared in the dark. They appeared almost gray, blending seamlessly into the mist that crept along the forest floor. I froze. My breath stilled, and I remained perfectly still, not blinking. They faced me. A sensation spread through me, not quite fear, but the sharp awareness of being watched. I felt exposed, like something small and preyed upon, standing in the open too long. Then I blinked, and the shapes were gone. I tried to rationalize it. Perhaps it had been a trick of the light or my mind pulling from Tyler's descriptions, a half-formed hallucination born of stress and isolation. But the unease that settled into my bones didn't fade with the excuses. Sleep eluded me that night, and when morning came, Tyler was already back at the fence. Part 2. It rained for 3 straight days, not the warm, intermittent kind that passed with the summer breeze, but a cold, relentless downpour that soaked into the wood of the walls and softened the firewood until it hissed and sputtered in the stove. The sky never brightened. Fog clung to the ground like spilled smoke, winding through the trees and draping itself over the fence. We stayed inside for most of that time. I cooked what I could from the boxes we'd brought with us, stretching canned soups and dry goods into something warm. Tyler spent hours at the drawing table, usually with crayons he found buried in the back of an old cabinet drawer. Page after page filled with images, trees, birds, the cabin, and sometimes the 2 of us. But no matter what else he sketched, one thing always appeared: the fence. On the 3rd day, Angela arrived. She showed up unannounced, soaked to the bone in a Forest Service jacket several sizes too large. After knocking twice, she let herself in with a quick, familiar nod, as though this was something we'd agreed upon. We'd only met her once before, when she first come up here. She had offered to check in every couple of weeks, saying she patrolled the old access trails for downed trees, poachers, and anything else that didn't belong. I hadn't expected her to follow through. I figured you might be running low on kerosene, she said as she stepped inside, water dripping from her sleeves. And this storm isn't letting up anytime soon. Thought I'd drop some off while I was in the area. Tyler took to her immediately, as he usually did with anyone new. He bombarded her with questions about mushrooms he'd found, about whether snapping turtles live this far north, and about how to tell the age of a tree by its bark. Angela answered what she could, her tone patient and unhurried, and deflected what she couldn't without making him feel dismissed. Then he brought up the fence. Angela's face changed. It was subtle but undeniable. Her posture remained still, but her eyes lost focus for a beat, just long enough for me to notice. "You know it goes for miles," she said, unscrewing the cap from a metal thermos she'd brought with her. "Longer than it has any business doing. Supposedly it's military property. Some of the maps don't even show it, which tells you what you need to know. No one's meant to go in, and nothing's supposed to come out." "That's what I told him," I added, trying to steer the conversation towards something lighter. But Tyler had already leaned in. I saw them again last night, he said. The herders. Angela's hand passed mid-pour, just for a second, but it was enough. What did you say? She asked. Her voice remained calm, but the ease had drained from it. The ones that walk along the fence, Tyler said. They were with the deer. They were pushing them back. Angela didn't answer. She finished pouring her coffee and set the thermos down. Steam curled between her fingers. Tyler waited for her to say more, but she avoided his eyes. You've got a vivid imagination, she said eventually. Just don't go past the fence. That land isn't for us. That was all she offered. She didn't elaborate, even when I tried to press her later, after Tyler had gone back out to check the water barrels. I followed her toward the door, hoping to coax more information from her before she left, but she kept her back to me. I'd keep them close, she said quietly. There are old things in these woods. Not all of them care who sees. Then she was gone. She didn't wait for the rain to let up or say goodbye. Porch boards creaked once beneath her boots and then went still. That night, the air felt wrong. Even the usual sounds, the steady drip of gutters, the whisper of wind in the eaves, had dulled as though something had muffled them. I'd just finished helping Tyler into bed when I heard a sudden rustling from the trees. It was not the delicate shuffle of foxes or raccoons, or the distant, playful yipping of coyotes. This was louder, thudding, crashing, the kind of noise made by large animals in a panic. I moved to the front window and listened closely. The sound built slowly, rising from the forest floor and climbing through the trees. Something was coming fast, just beyond the fence. Tyler appeared at my side without a word. His eyes were wide and alert, and it was clear he hadn't been asleep. They're driving them, he said softly, just like before. What do you mean? They push the deer, he explained, just fast enough so they go back. If they don't, the herders stop walking. The crashing grew louder. We stepped onto the porch together. I grabbed a flashlight from its hook beside the door, but I didn't turn it on. I wasn't sure I wanted whatever was out there to know we were watching. At first, nothing appeared. Trees swayed in the half-light, and rain clung to the fence in long, trembling lines. Then the deer broke through the underbrush. 6 or 7 of them burst into view, hooves skidding in the mud, tongues lolling, their coats soaked and matted with leaves. They charged toward the fence, frantic and disoriented. I thought they were going to slam into it. But at the last moment they veered. Each animal turned sharply and bolted back into the woods. One staggered and stumbled before regaining its footing. None of them tried to cross. Then we saw the figures emerge. They slipped out from between the trees like smoke, tall and indistinct. Their forms were human-like in shape, but off in ways that unsettled the eye. They moved in slow, steady patterns behind the deer, not chasing them, but guiding them as though conducting a silent, invisible boundary. There were 4, one on each flank, one directly behind the herd, one several paces back from the others, trailing behind like an observer. Even in the dimness, something about their movement felt unnatural. Their limbs were too long, their frames too still. Their motion was not reactive, nor cautious. It was coordinated and unchanging, like a tide that followed no sound or signal. And then the figure in the rear stopped. It didn't follow the others, it simply halted and turned, or at least shifted in a way that suggested its attention was now on us. I couldn't make out a face, but I knew it was looking in our direction. I didn't need to see eyes to feel its awareness. A static sensation prickled against my skin as though a storm were about to break overhead. I wanted to step back to pull Tyler inside and shut the door, to forget the entire encounter, but my feet would not move. I could not explain what the figure was, and I did not understand what it wanted. Yet I knew with almost absolute certainty that it had seen us. We stood like that for nearly a full minute, staring across the distance. The rain did not ease. The shapes did not advance. Then, without warning, the rear figure turned, its entire body twisted, not like a person pivoting on their feet, but as though the shape itself had been unspooled and rewound. It flowed back into motion, soundless and deliberate. The others followed. Within moments, the herders disappeared into the trees. Fog and foliage swallowed them completely. We went back inside. Neither Tyler nor I spoke. Whatever he had seen before, whatever name he had given those shapes, I no longer doubted him, and although I wanted to explain the encounter, to rationalize it somehow, to anchor it to something real, no explanation came. The fence had kept them out. That much seemed true. But I had begun to wonder if it had been built for that reason at all. Part 3. The news came through the crank radio sometime afternoon. It crackled between static and weather updates, sandwiched between a report on soil erosion and a warning about bear activity near the Blue Ridge trailheads. The broadcast was brief and without flourish. A hiker, male, mid-30s, name withheld, had vanished 3 days earlier while traveling a solo route through one of the old military corridors southeast of High Peaks. Search efforts had begun, but were expected to be slow, due to difficult terrain and the lingering effects of the recent storm. I stood at the window while the report looped, the voice rising and falling, beneath the churn of static. Outside, Tyler sat cross-legged at the far end of the yard. His knees were tucked into his chest, arms looped around him, and his back hunched slightly forward. I couldn't see his face from where I stood, but the way he held himself made it clear. He wasn't just staring into the woods. He was watching for something. Angela arrived later that afternoon. She carried a gallon of water in one hand and a small pack of batteries in the other. Her arrival was quieter than usual, and she didn't linger long. I mentioned the missing hiker, hoping for a flicker of concern or surprise. She only nodded once and set the supplies on the counter. "That happens more than they report," she said. I asked her what that meant. She didn't answer immediately, but the look in her eyes had changed. She adjusted the straps on her bag, glancing toward the tree line before speaking again. "They never find them," she said. "That's the part they leave out." Then she turned and left. I watched her disappear into the woods without looking back. That night, something felt off inside the cabin. I found a cabinet door swinging open and several granola bar wrappers scattered across the counter. At first, I assumed it was mice, but when I reached for the box, I realized 5 bars were missing, and the back door had been left ajar, the handle slick with condensation. That wasn't something I would have overlooked. I stepped outside and found that Tyler's rain boots were gone from the back step. I grabbed the flashlight and followed a faint trail of crushed grass leading toward the trees. The prints were subtle but visible in the wet earth. About 20 feet from the fence line, just before the first coil of barbed wire, I found the boots. They stood side by side in the mud, perfectly aligned. In front of them sat 2 granola bars, placed neatly on a flat stone. A folded napkin had been set beside them, weighted down with a small pebble. Nothing else around the area had been disturbed. There were no footprints apart from Tyler's, no animal tracks, and no marks in the grass that would suggest movement beyond this point. Only the low, ever-present hum of the fence and the shifting of wet leaves overhead. I gathered the boots, the food, and the napkin, and carried them back to the cabin. Tyler was sitting in the living room with a book in his lap. He wasn't reading. His eyes weren't moving across the page. He didn't look up when I came in. When I dropped the napkin on the table beside him, he didn't flinch. "You don't feed them," I said. I tried to keep my voice calm, but it came out strained. "You don't leave things out there. You understand?" He said nothing. "I'm serious, Tyler. You don't go past the stump. You don't talk to them. You don't give them anything. You don't invite them. He sat still for several long seconds and then replied, "They're not bad." "You don't know that." "They're not," he insisted, his voice quiet but firm. "They're just different." He looked up at me then. His expression wasn't fearful or ashamed. It was something else, something like disappointment, as though I had failed to understand something he thought should have been obvious. That night he went to bed without protest. I couldn't sleep. Every sound outside the cabin made my skin crawl. At sunrise, I went out back to split kindling. The ground was soft beneath my boots, and the mist had returned, curling low across the yard. I'd just raised the hatchet when something moved at the far edge of the clearing. A man stumbled out of the trees. He looked like he'd been thrown forward, like someone had pushed him just hard enough to knock him loose from the woods. His shirt hung in tatters, his jeans were soaked and streaked with mud, and the right side of his face was raw with scrapes. At first, I thought he might be a lost hunter or part of the search party, but then I saw his eyes. They were wide and rimmed in red, barely focusing. He moved like someone who had forgotten how, each step unstable, one leg uselessly dragging behind him, and he crossed the space between the trees and the fence without hesitation, slipping past the first post and staggering into the stretch of open yard between our home and the boundary. I took a step forward, about to call out, but he stopped. Something was wrong. It wasn't just his gait or his expression. It was the forest behind him. The trees had parted, not physically, but in some invisible way that allowed the space behind him to feel open, exposed. I couldn't see movement, but I could sense presence. The herders stood in a half circle at the forest's edge. They did not gesture or advance, but I knew they were watching him. The man paused mid-step. He turned slowly, as though remembering something he wasn't supposed to. His body twisted toward the fence, and for a moment, I thought he might flee. Instead, he raised one foot, and then he was gone. No sound, no motion. One moment he existed, and the next he did not, like a frame cut from a reel of film. The herders lingered a moment longer, the mist thickening around them. Then, as one, they shifted backward into the trees, retreating as fluidly and silently as they had come. When I returned to the porch, Tyler was standing in the doorway. He'd seen everything. He said nothing, and I didn't ask. That day passed in silence. So did the next. He stopped drawing. He stopped asking questions. At night, I would pause outside his door and hear him whispering. Sometimes I caught fragments, words like turning, walking, or waiting. More often it was nonsense, muttered phrases that followed no logic, spoken in a tone that felt detached from the boy I knew. I began locking the doors at night, though I knew it wouldn't matter. Not if the herders wanted to come closer, and not if Tyler wanted to go. Something had shifted. It was more than the disappearance of birdsong or the way the woods seemed to listen when we stepped outside. It was as though a boundary had been crossed, some invisible line we hadn't noticed until we were already on the wrong side of it. We had seen them, and now they had seen us. Part 4. Angela returned 3 days later. The clouds that morning hung low and heavy, thick with enough to dull the colors of the trees and cast the entire clearing in a dim gray hush. I heard her approach before I saw her, the soft rhythm of boots in the porch, followed by a pause just outside the door. She didn't knock. The door creaked open, and by the time I came down the stairs, she was already inside. She looked exactly as she had before, wrapped in the same oversized Forest Service jacket, hair pulled back beneath a wet hood. But something had changed. Her face carried the same tired lines I remembered, but now there was something else beneath the surface, something taut and unspoken in her eyes. She didn't ask how Tyler was. She didn't comment on the weather or the fog. She just stood near the door, wringing her hands once before lifting her gaze to meet mine. "He's seen too much," she said. I opened my mouth to ask who she meant, but the answer was obvious. I'd known it before she spoke. I'd seen it in Tyler's face, the way he moved through the house, like a guest in someone else's life. Angela didn't wait for me to speak. She stepped forward slightly and continued. "They've noticed him," she said. "And once that happens, they don't forget." Her voice wasn't dramatic, it wasn't cryptic. It was flat, devoid of inflection, as if the words had been rehearsed too many times to carry emotion anymore. "You've seen them too," she added. It wasn't a question. I nodded. Angela let out a shallow breath and looked down at the floor. She took her time before speaking again, as if choosing her words carefully. "They don't cross past the trees, not usually. Not in all the years I've been up here. But something's changed. The rules, whatever they are, aren't holding the way they used to." She paused, then continued. "Boundaries are being redrawn, and once something crosses, once it steps through, you can't go after it. You don't follow. That's the one thing I've learned that still matters." I wanted to press her. I wanted to know who she had followed and what she had seen. I wanted her to say more, to give me something that made sense, but her expression stopped me. "What happens if you do?" I asked. Angela looked at me for a long time. Her mouth parted slightly, then closed again. I could see her struggling, wanting to protect me, perhaps, or just not wanting to relive the truth. When she finally spoke, her voice remained steady. "You don't come back the same," she said. "That's if you come back at all." She turned toward the door, and the wind caught the edge of her hood and tugged it sideways, revealing the thin streaks of gray in her hair. "They wait at the edge," she said, "but they reach farther than you think." Then she stepped outside, disappearing into the thick curtain of fog that had gathered near the tree line. I listened as her footsteps faded into silence and the boards of the porch settled behind her. I didn't follow. I didn't call out. I remained where I was, standing in the center of the living room while the walls around me creaked with the weight of moisture and time. That night, I realized the animals were gone. At first, I thought it was my imagination. The change had been gradual, fewer birds during the day, fewer owl calls at night. But now the silence was complete. When I stepped onto the porch after putting Tyler to bed, I noticed how still the forest had become. There were no crickets, no frogs, no movement in the underbrush. Even the wind had died, leaving the air feeling suspended and unresponsive. I waited. 10 minutes passed, then 20. I walked the length of the porch, checked the side yard, and stared at the fence until my vision blurred. Nothing moved, nothing stirred. I went back inside and locked the door. When I woke the next morning, Tyler was gone. His bed was empty. The blanket had been folded neatly at the foot, something he had never done before. The pillow remained undisturbed, still shaped from where his head had rested during the night. I checked the bathroom, the pantry, and the small loft above the main room, but every space was still and silent. The back door hung slightly open. I grabbed my flashlight and pulled on my boots, still damp from the morning before. The yard was covered in dew, and the grass shimmered with beads of silver that clung to my legs as I ran. I followed the trail instinctively, spotting the faint impressions of small feet pressed into the flattened grass, leading away from the cabin and toward the edge of the property. When I reached the trees, I saw his flashlight first. It lay just beyond the final fence post, tilted sideways in the grass, flickering weakly as its battery sputtered out. The mist had returned, thicker now, curling over the forest floor and spilling through the break in the fence. I stepped forward and reached through the gap, expecting the usual resistance from rusted wire, but there was none. The barbed wire had parted cleanly. There were no tools, no sign of forest, just a silent, open space wide enough for a child to slip through without catching their clothes. I moved toward the flashlight. As I approached, the beam dimmed and vanished. The last thing it illuminated was a series of small footprints, bare feet, spaced evenly, heading deeper into the woods. There were no drag marks, torn fabric, or signs of struggle, only Tyler's footprints leading away from home. I called his name once, then again. No voice returned. No movement answered. I scanned the trees, slowly searching for any sign, any flicker of gray, any unnatural shape among the trunks, but the forest offered nothing. There were no herders or shadows, no presence at all. The woods had gone still. I stepped back across the fence line and stood there, unsure of what to do. My heart did not pound, my hands did not tremble. What I felt was colder than fear, a deep, quiet resignation. Tyler had crossed a line and something had let him go, or taken him, or both. And now, whatever had once held that line in place had been erased. They were no longer waiting. Part 5. I didn't call the ranger station. I didn't try to find a signal or contact the search teams. There was no point in pretending this was a normal disappearance. Tyler hadn't gone missing in the way people go missing. He had gone beyond the line, the one Angela had warned me about, the one we hadn't known existed until it was too late to turn back. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I packed. It didn't take long. I figured what I thought I might need: for water bottle, flashlight with fresh batteries, the heavy coat from the rack, and the old hunting knife I'd found months earlier at the back of a drawer and never used. I didn't know what I expected to encounter. I just knew if Tyler had crossed, then I had no choice but to follow. The light that morning felt wrong. It filtered through the trees in soft layers, diffused and muted, as if the sun were rising beyond fog glass. The shadows drifted without direction, and the air carried no scent, no pine, no damp earth, not even the lingering odor of smoke from our stove. The birds, when they appeared, moved strangely. They flitted from branch to branch without purpose or speed, their flight slow and loose, like puppets, suspended from strings that had gone slack. I crossed the fence just after noon. The barbed wire offered no resistance. It sagged between the posts, open and welcoming, like a curtain drawn aside for a performer's entrance. I stepped through the gap and left everything familiar behind. The forest on the other side was not the one I knew. The silence struck me first. What little noise I could hear, the soft crunch of moss beneath my boots, the quiet rhythm of my own breath, sounded distant, as if echoing from a place several feet removed from where I stood. The light behaved strangely. It shimmered in pools across the forest floor, shifting without any clear source. There was no visible sun, no warmth, and no identifiable direction. Shadows twisted in ways that defied the terrain. Some stretched out sideways and merged into nothing, others shrank inward, tightening unnaturally with each step I took. I walked carefully, scanning the ground for any signs. A bent fern, a small red thread caught on a thorn, the faint impression of a bare foot in the moss, with toes pointed inward, as if the child who had left it had stood still for a long time. There was no clear trail, only moments of suggestion. The path revealed itself in fragments, and I found myself moving as much by instinct as by logic. Sometimes I thought I was walking in circles. At other times, it felt like I was passing into new ground with every step. But each time I began to doubt, something pulled me forward. A steady flicker of light ahead, too constant to be sunlight and too low to be a fire. Once I glimpsed a piece of blue fabric disappearing behind a tree. It matched the jacket Tyler had worn the day before. I called his name only once. Only once. The sound did not echo the way it should have. It bounced strangely, breaking apart as if the trees themselves were absorbing the syllables. I kept moving. There was no way to measure time in that place. My watch had stopped sometime before I crossed the fence, and the light above never changed. For all I knew, I'd walked for an hour or for an entire day. And then I saw him. He stood at the base of a pale-barked tree, with one hand resting lightly against the trunk. His other arm hung loosely by his side, his back was to me, and his head tilted slightly upward as though he were listening to something far away, something I could not hear. Tyler! He turned slowly. His face had changed. It looked thinner, paler, as if the color had been slowly drained from his skin. His eyes met mine, and I froze. There was recognition in them, but behind that familiarity was something else, something vast and unreadable. "You came," he said. His voice was soft, not flat, but without emotion. "I came to take you home," I said. He didn't respond right away. His gaze drifted past me and then returned. Finally, he spoke again. "They want to show you." I felt my throat tighten. "Who?" "You'll see," he said. "You have to see before you understand." He turned back to the woods and raised his hand. He pointed into the trees. I followed his gesture. They had gathered. The herders stood in a wide ring between the trunks, dozens of them, maybe more. Each figure was tall, gray, and silent, arranged with precision. They had no faces, no identifiable markings, yet I could tell they were not all identical. Some stood straighter than others, some leaned slightly forward. All of them were still. I turned back toward Tyler, but he was gone. Panic surged through me, immediate and cold. My legs locked and my chest tightened. I spun in a slow circle searching for him, but saw only trees and the ring of herders. They did not move, they only watched. Then something shifted behind my eyes, a strange, painless pressure building rapidly. My vision blurred and my balance faltered. I tried to speak, to call for Tyler, but my mouth would not form the words. My limbs felt distant, as though they belonged to someone else. The ground tilted, the forest reeled, and everything went dark. I woke in the cabin. At first I thought I had dreamed the entire thing, that I had fainted from exhaustion or panic, and that nothing beyond the fence had been real. But my boots were caked with black mud, the flashlight in my hand was cracked at the lens, and the jacket I had worn was damp with dew that did not belong inside a sealed house. The back door was shut, latched from the inside. Tyler was gone. I searched every room in the cabin. I checked the bathroom, the loft, the root cellar, and the attic. His bed was still made. His shoes were still inside the earth, but he was no longer here. I stepped outside. The fence had returned. It stood tall and taut, barbed wire threaded cleanly across each post. There was no gap now, no sign it had ever parted. No footprints remained in the grass. It was as if the passage had never opened at all. Angela never came back. I waited 3 days, then a week. There were no further news reports, no search parties, no notes slipped under the door. Life, beyond the fence, resumed its rhythm. Birds returned to the trees, insects hummed in the grass. The breeze moved through the clearing with ordinary intent, but things were not the same. Sometimes at dusk, I step out onto the porch and look toward the tree line. I don't always see them, but sometimes I do. Tall, unmoving figures, gray against the trees, just beyond the reach of light. And sometimes, among them, I see one that is smaller than the rest. One that stands a little apart, one that does not quite match. He never speaks, never steps forward, but I know he sees me. And sometimes, when I try to remember my mother's face, when I stare at the photograph above the fireplace until my eyes sting, her features fade the moment I look away. But I remember Tyler's, and I know he remembers me. And that was The Grey Herders by Laurel and Veitch, performed by yours truly, Otis Jiry.
Let me tell you, Otis, when the local ranger starts avoiding your questions and deer are being turned back like they hit a tripwire in the woods, it's time to pack your bags.
Or at least stay on this side of the fence. But don't get too comfortable, friends, because the next thing that lingers might be a memory you forgot on purpose.
Up next, we meet a man whose son starts acting off, standing too still, staring too long, and when a childhood warning comes echoing back from the edge of the trees, he realizes this isn't just his past creeping in. This is Never Run, Never Scream by E.C. Danner, performed by yours truly, Malcolm Blackwood. Part 1. I first noticed something different in Owen when the heat broke and the evenings cooled enough to leave the windows open. There hadn't been an incident, no fever, no fall, nothing to blame, just a sudden and unshakable quiet that didn't belong to a 6-year-old boy. He spent more and more time near the edge of the yard, standing where the grass ended and the trees began. His arms hung loosely at his sides, and he stared straight ahead. His posture wasn't rigid, but there was an intentional stillness to it, like he was trying to imitate something. When I asked what he was looking at, he'd say, "Nothing," but it never felt like nothing. Not when he suddenly shifted his stance as I approached. Not when his eyes flicked back toward the trees, as if waiting for them to move before he did. One afternoon, I stood behind the sliding door, watching him through the screen. He hadn't moved from where he'd been the day before. His chin was slightly raised, his lips moving as if he were speaking, but no sound reached me. I called his name twice, but he didn't react. Only when I stepped out onto the deck and called again did he finally turn. His expression was calm, maybe even a little curious, as though he wasn't sure why I was there or what I wanted. "Who were you talking to?" I asked. "No one," he replied. "Did someone come by?" He shook his head and glanced back toward the trees. "He's not someone," he said. The next day I came home from work to find him crouched in the same spot. He was tracing something in the dirt, whispering too softly for me to understand. As I approached, he stood up and brushed his hands on his shorts. "What were you doing out here?" I asked. He turned toward the trees. "Just listening," he said. "To what?" "He doesn't like to talk," Owen replied. After a beat, he added, "You shouldn't run from him. He sees better when you move fast." There's a particular kind of stillness that settles into your body when something from your own childhood, the kind of thing you spent years convincing yourself never happened, comes back in someone else's voice. That phrase, the warning, I had heard it before. That night, after Owen had gone to bed, I took a flashlight out to the edge of the yard. I didn't go far, just past the fence, far enough for the scent of the soil to shift and for the air to grow damp in a way it hadn't been just a few steps back. The insects sounded different there. The usual rhythm was off, less like buzzing and more like something faintly electronic but not quite artificial. I kept the flashlight beam low, sweeping the base of the trees carefully. About 5 feet in, I stopped. There was nothing to see, but the air felt charged, still. It pressed in close without touching me. A prickling sensation ran across the back of my neck, as if something had turned toward me. I remembered the first time I'd felt that, decades earlier, during a summer trip to Arizona. I'd been 10, exploring a trail on Camelback Mountain. It was hot that year, the kind of heat that lingered through September. I'd paused near the base of a sandstone outcrop, standing just outside the shade of a formation that always seemed to hold the same dim light no matter the hour. That was the summer my grandmother warned me not to run or scream, not past the saguaro line. At the time, it hadn't made any sense. Now, it made far too much. Part 2. In the summer of 1996, my parents put me on a plane with a tag looped through my belt and a manila envelope tucked under my arm. Inside were my medical records, emergency contacts, and a handwritten note from my mother that read, "Josh likes peanut butter, hates peas, bedtime at 9. I remember the flight attendant assigned to watch me. She wore too much perfume, vanilla and smoke, and her nails were bright red. I spent the descent staring at her shoes, trying not to look out the window. The desert stretching below made my stomach tighten. The sky was too wide. It had corners I didn't understand. Grandma B met me at Sky Harbor Airport, standing beneath a faded arrival sign. She wore a wide-brimmed straw hat and held a dented thermos. She gave me one firm hug, kissed my forehead, and handed me a pair of sunglasses far too large for my face. "Don't squint," she said. "You'll age like a raisin." Her house sat just off a winding dirt road lined with broken fencing and Palo Verde trees. The mountains in the distance hunched like sleeping giants. The air outside was dry and unnervingly still for late morning. Her front door was a sun-bleached turquoise, and the screen creaked when she opened it. There was no central air inside, only ceiling fans that rotated slowly and hummed with the sound of tired metal. What I noticed first wasn't the heat or the quiet, but the dog waiting in the hallway. She was tawny and long-legged, her pointed ears and a narrow face that reminded me of a fox. Her tail stood out behind her like a stiff brush, and her eyes never left mine. "That's Lucy," Grandma said, hanging her hat on a hook beside the door. "She's a mutt, smart, but thinks too much." Lucy didn't bark, she didn't sniff, she just watched. "She'll sleep by your door at night," Grandma added as she moved toward the kitchen. "Don't worry, she knows what she's doing." That evening, after dinner, grilled cheese with tomato slices on the side, we sat outside while the sky shifted into streaks of purple and salmon. The sun didn't so much set as slowly disappear behind the mountain, lowering itself inch by inch as though reluctant to leave. Grandma lit a citronella candle and took a sip from her thermos. I had realized by then it no longer held lemonade. She looked at me over the rim of her glasses. "You're not city soft, are you?" "I don't think so." "Well, good. You'll be fine then." She set her thermos down and stared out toward the horizon, where a line of saguaros stood perfectly still. "You can roam a bit if you want. Just stay within sight of the house and mind the wash. Rattlers hole up in there when the sun's high." I nodded. "One more thing," she said, brushing something from her knee. "This was something your grandfather told me back when we moved out here. He was Army, saw things he wouldn't name, and not much ever rattled him. But out here, past the saguaro line..." She paused. I waited. "He always said, 'Never run, never scream.' You understand?" I blinked, unsure if she was serious or trying to spook me. "Just don't do it," she said. "If you see something, stay calm. Walk home slowly with your eyes ahead, and if it follows..." She stopped there. Her hands went to her drink, and the rest of the sentence was lost to the clink of ice. The next morning, I woke to find Lucy waiting at the end of the hallway. Her tail hung low and her ears pointed straight ahead. When I entered the kitchen, she followed close behind. She didn't sniff or nudge. She moved beside me like we had done this routine for years. After breakfast, I asked if I could go exploring. Grandma handed me a canteen and a wide-brimmed hat. "Remember what I said," she told me. "No running, no yelling, and if it feels wrong, turn around." The backyard opened into desert. The fence had long since collapsed and been overtaken by mesquite and cholla. I followed a game trail past the tool shed and a chicken coop that hadn't seen chickens in years. The path dipped across a shallow wash where the sand turned reddish and the air smelled faintly of copper. Lucy walked beside me until we reached the first ridge. That's where she stopped. I turned around and called for her. She sat down in the dirt, panting gently, but didn't move. Her eyes remained fixed on the horizon. "Come on," I said, patting my leg. "It's not far." She didn't follow. "You're really not coming?" She didn't budge. So I kept going. The farther I walked, the more the landscape changed. The brush grew sparse, the ground harder. The sun pressed relentlessly against my back, and the breeze shifted in tone. It wasn't a whistle or a rustle, but a dry buzzing sound, like air forced through cracked teeth. I came across what looked like an old foundation half buried in sand. Near it was a ring of stones, possibly the remnants of a fire pit. A nearby outcrop bore shallow carvings along its inner face. They weren't letters I recognized, just shapes and loops, some resembling open mouths or twisted symbols. I crouched to get a better look, and behind me, gravel shifted. I turned quickly, but nothing was there. I took a cautious step backward toward the path. Then I saw it. At the edge of the rocks beyond the juniper scrub, a shape stood among the brush. It was tall, not quite a person, but too structured to be a tree. It didn't sway or lean. It didn't react to the gusts that passed around it. It was simply there. My mouth went dry. I blinked, and it was gone. My grandmother's warning fresh in my mind, I turned and began walking back toward the ridge, avoiding any sort of stride that could even remotely be considered a run. When the house finally came into view, Lucy was exactly where I had left her. Her tail no longer moved. Her head was high, nose twitching. She didn't bark or run to greet me. She waited until I passed her, then fell in beside me, silent and steady, as if she understood exactly what I had seen. Part 3. The quiet changed first. In the weeks after I walked past the ridge, the desert stopped sounding the way I remembered. There had always been a certain rhythm to its silence, something built from the quiet friction of life. Cicadas ticking in the brush, the scratch of birds shifting in the dust, the distant rasp of wind as it struggled across stone. Now that subtle chorus had gone missing. The places that had once whispered with movement felt drained, and in the absence of sound, I began to notice footsteps. They were never loud, just the faint crunch of sand or the brittle snap of twigs behind me. The sound would vanish the moment I turned, retreating into stillness, as if it had never existed. At first, I thought it might be Lucy keeping her distance, but she had not crossed the ridge since that first day, and I never saw her leave the house when I did. I began walking the trail with my shoulders braced and my head forward, forcing myself not to look behind me. But I always listened. I didn't tell Grandma. She had already warned me once, and I wasn't sure I wanted to know what she'd say if I admitted I had ignored her. Late in July, I stayed out longer than I should have. The sky had begun shifting to deep orange and violet by the time I realized how far I had wandered. I had followed the edge of the wash down past a row of shale ridges that didn't look familiar. The air had cooled quickly with the sunset, and the breeze cut against my skin in dry, sharp bursts. As I climbed up the embankment, I heard it again. Footsteps, just a few behind mine, close enough to register but not close enough to place. I froze, and the sound stopped instantly. I stood motionless, flashlight still unlit in my hand, fingers tightening against the metal. My skin prickled with the sense that something nearby wasn't just watching, but observing, studying me. I didn't run. I remembered what Grandma had said. I walked back, each step deliberate, holding my breath until I saw the porch light appear through the brush. Grandma was waiting for me. She stood just outside the front door, arms crossed, lips pressed together in a tight, unreadable line. The screen behind her was closed and locked. Lucy sat at her feet, ears pinned flat against her head. "You were out past sundown," she said. "I lost track of time. Don't do it again." Her voice wasn't raised, but it carried the same weight as the desert beyond her fence. She reached back, shut the front door, and turned the deadbolt, once, then twice. She didn't ask if I'd seen anything. I didn't offer an explanation. After that night, she began locking every window before dusk and kept the porch light on until morning. I started sleeping with the sheet pulled up to my chin, even when the night stayed warm. A few days later, the nightmare came. In the dream, I woke to a soft tapping against my bedroom window. At first, I thought it was a branch or maybe a moth, but the sound came with intention. 3 taps, evenly spaced, then silence. I rose from bed and stepped toward the window. Outside, crouched just beneath the sill, was a figure. It wasn't pressed to the glass. It didn't peer in or press its face close. It simply knelt, its spine arched unnaturally, one shoulder raised higher than the other. Its head tilted at an angle that didn't seem natural. Not aggressive or curious, but analytical, as if I were a shape it couldn't quite define. Its mouth was stretched wide, impossibly so, but completely still. No breath, no sound, just that open mouth, waiting. I woke with sweat across my chest and the sheet tangled around my legs. The window was closed and locked, but when I leaned in, I saw 3 smudges on the glass. They were the length of fingers, spaced evenly apart. I didn't sleep again until the sun rose. The last day I spent alone in the wash was the day I broke the rule. It was just past noon. The air shimmered with heat and the rocks blurred at the edges. I had packed a peanut butter sandwich and a can of ginger ale in my backpack and was sitting beneath a stub-limbed mesquite tree at the base of the ridge, watching dust swirl around the shallow wash. Lucy had followed me part of the way that morning, stopping, again, at the same familiar point where the incline shifted. I could still see her from where I sat, her figure still as a post at the crest of the slope. By then, I had convinced myself the footsteps were tricks of the ear, echoes, animals, nerves. I had grown too used to the quiet. Then I heard it again. This time, it didn't come from behind me. It came from somewhere off to the left, deeper in the wash. The sound was heavier than before, slower. It dragged across the ground with weight. I stood, feeling the hairs on my arms rise. I scanned the brush slowly, trying not to move too quickly or sharply. Then, between two boulders, a tall, ill-proportioned figure stepped into view. Its limbs were too long, and its posture didn't resemble that of anything I recognized. I couldn't see its face. I wasn't sure it even had one. It didn't lunge, hiss, or advance at all. It simply was. And that was worse. My body moved before I could stop it. I ran. I barely made it 10 feet before something hit me hard from the side. I hit the ground, elbow scraping rock, and let out a startled yell. It wasn't the creature. It was Lucy. She stood over me, growling low, her body rigid and braced against mine. I started to rise, but she snapped her head toward the rocks and let out a single bark, sharp and warning. I froze. At the edge of the path, something moved. It wasn't enough to be certain, just a twitch at the periphery. Just enough to make me question what I had seen before. But nothing stepped forward. Lucy remained between me and that part of the wash for the entire walk home. She never looked away. She didn't leave my side once. That night, Grandma sat me down in the kitchen. She didn't scold me or ask questions. She poured herself a drink and stared out the window above the sink. "You ran, didn't you?" I nodded. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't sigh. She didn't even seem surprised. After a moment, she said, "He knows you now." Then she turned away, and that was the end of it. Part 4. I stayed inside for the next 3 days. I didn't speak much, and I didn't stray far from the windows. Lucy wouldn't leave the back door. She lay curled on the mat with her chin resting on her paws, ears twitching at every floorboard creak or shift in the wind outside. Grandma didn't ask questions. She moved more quietly than usual, watching me out of the corners of her eyes, like I was someone else's child she'd agreed to watch for a while. She started leaving the radio on during dinner. It played old country songs from the 60s, fuzzy, warbling tunes that filled the silence without demanding attention. She also began pouring her drinks earlier in the evening. Once, I caught her standing at the kitchen window, staring out at the base of the hills. Her hands gripped the sink's edge, and her lips moved silently, as if she were reciting something she wasn't sure she remembered correctly. On the fourth morning, something shifted. The stillness that had taken root inside the house, the tension in the walls, the quiet pacing of Lucy's feet on the tile, eased slightly. Not completely, but enough that I noticed. A breeze came in from the north, steady and dry, carrying a sound I hadn't heard in weeks. Insects. Faint at first, barely more than a whisper, but it was life returning, testing the edges of the quiet. Even Grandma seemed to sense the change. She opened the front door and swept for the first time in days. For the first time since I saw the figure, I began to think I might be able to step outside again. I told myself I would only go as far as the ridge. I would stay within sight of the house and return before noon. I wasn't planning to test anything. I only wanted to see that the desert still belonged to itself. Grandma had fallen asleep in her chair when I slipped out. Lucy tried to follow, but I stepped out quickly and shut the screen door before she could push past. I didn't want her getting hurt again because of me. The path beyond the house looked unchanged. The same dusty trail, the same collapsed fence, the same red brush curling around the edges of the dry wash. But something about the space felt subtly off. The light seemed too bright, and the shadows cast by the saguaros didn't quite settle where they should have. There was a looseness to the landscape, as if its outlines had been sketched instead of drawn. I walked the ridge with measured steps, dragging my shoes through the gravel just enough to hear the sound they made. I listened carefully, scanning the familiar terrain for anything out of place. Nothing moved. The trail ahead remained still. I passed the spot where Lucy had tackled me. Her prints were still visible in the dirt, softened by time but still distinct. I should have turned back, but I didn't. It wasn't curiosity that carried me forward. It wasn't defiance either. It felt more like gravity, like the pull you feel when staring too long into deep water. You don't want to step in, but something in you wonders how long you could hold your breath. The arch, sitting recessed into a crumbling sandstone ridge, wasn't visible until I was nearly on top of it. Its curve was imperfect, jagged in places, as if something enormous had once forced its way through and left the wound behind. The temperature dropped as I stepped beneath it, not enough to chill me, but enough to raise goosebumps on my arms. The air carried a wrongness that I couldn't define. It didn't smell like rot or blood or ozone. It didn't resemble anything I could name. It was simply unfamiliar, an alien scent that didn't belong to wind or stone or life. I turned, suddenly certain I wasn't alone. That was when I screamed. The sound tore out of me before I could think to stop it, a high, involuntary snap of panic that split the air like a crack in glass, and the world responded. Everything around me changed at once. The wind paused, the light froze, the colors drained slightly from the sky. It was like something aware had taken notice and paused the moment to listen more closely, as if every particle around me had turned its attention to a single point. Then it appeared. I didn't see it emerge, it was simply there, gaunt, imposing, taller than any person I'd ever seen. Its limbs were too long, its torso too thin, its frame shaped like it had been built to slip between things rather than move through them. Its arms hung nearly to its knees, its fingers stretched far beyond human proportion. Its face, or what passed for one, lacked any identifiable features except for the two black hollows where its eyes should have been. Those weren't sockets, they were voids, tunnels cut through the illusion of shape and memory and flesh. Looking into them was like glimpsing the bottom of something without end. They didn't reflect light, they absorbed it, and they were looking back. I couldn't move. My lungs pulled air, but the motion felt wrong, mechanical, unsatisfying, like breathing in the memory of oxygen without the substance. The creature didn't speak. It didn't reach toward me or threaten in any way. It tilted its head slightly, as if it were trying to understand what I was. The angle matched what I'd seen in the dream, detached, analytical. Then, from my left, something collided with it. Lucy. She hit it mid-stride, fur bristling, teeth bared. Her body passed into it, not against it, as if the creature weren't solid, more suggestion than structure. There was no sound of impact, no struggle. She disappeared into its form, and the figure flickered, not as if injured, but as if interrupted. Its outline warped the way a reflection bends across rippling water. I stumbled backward. My heel struck the edge of the arch behind me, and the moment shattered. The weight in the air lifted, the light returned to its proper shade. Insects began to hum again in the distance. Wind moved the brush, and everything resumed. I turned and ran, and didn't stop until I reached the porch. My legs went out from under me as I hit the steps, and I pressed my back against the door, struggling to breathe. Lucy was gone. Grandma found me later that evening. I don't know how long I sat there, but the sun had lowered again when her car pulled into the drive. She didn't call my name or rush from the vehicle. She just stepped out, walked toward me with slow, even steps, and looked at me like something had changed permanently between us. She helped me up and didn't say anything. We drove back to the house without a word. The tires rolled over the dirt with a soft, papery crunch. When she parked, she sat behind the wheel for a long moment, hands resting gently at 10 and 2. Finally, without looking at me, she said, "He saw you, but you lived." Then she opened her door and went inside. Things were never the same after that. Part 5. Present Day. By the time I found the drawing, I'd already started to worry. Owen had grown quiet. I'd seen him standing at the edge of the yard, whispering to someone I couldn't see. His posture had changed. He no longer twitched or shifted the way children do when they're bored or restless. He held still the way a deer does when it knows something else is watching. Still, part of me had hoped it was just a phase, a 6-year-old's imagination, something borrowed from a cartoon or repeated from a story he didn't understand. I hadn't let myself believe it meant anything more. Then I opened his sketchbook. It had been tucked between the pages, half hidden beneath his pillow. He hadn't meant to hide it. He was still too young for secrets. But he'd hesitated when I walked into the room earlier that day, closing the book a little too fast. I hadn't thought much of it at the time. Not until later that evening, when the memory of the arch and those hollow eyes came rushing back. The drawing was crude in the way most children's drawings are, but something about the proportions turned my stomach. The figure's legs were too long, stretching nearly to the bottom edge of the paper. Its arms hung well past its waist, ending in dark, knotted fingers. It had no mouth, no nose, just 2 black circles for eyes, scribbled so hard the paper had nearly torn through. All around it were looping lines, coiled into spirals that seemed to pull away from the figure. The next morning, I asked him about it over breakfast. "What is it?" I said, tapping the edge of the page. Owen didn't hesitate. "It's the man from the trees," he replied, calm as ever. "The one who watches real still." I asked if he'd seen it in a dream, and he shook his head. "No," he said. "Sometimes I see him in the morning, before you wake up." He was unafraid and said it like he was describing a neighbor, familiar and expected. That was when he started asking about dogs. Not dogs in general. Lucy. A name I hadn't spoken aloud in years. "Can dogs protect you when they're gone?" he asked one night while brushing his teeth. He didn't look at me when he said it. His tone wasn't casual. It carried the kind of weight that comes with a question asked more than once in a child's mind before it's spoken. I crouched beside him and asked, "What made you think of that?" He shrugged, but his answer came without pause. "She sits by the trees sometimes. She doesn't come inside, but she looks at me like she remembers." I didn't respond. I wasn't sure how to. That night, after he'd gone to sleep, I pulled an old storage box from the attic. It was one I hadn't touched since before Owen was born. Inside were newspaper clippings, a few faded Polaroids, and a worn leather collar with a tarnished brass tag which read, "Lucy," etched in block letters. When I turned it over in my hand, the tag struck the edge of the box and made a sound sharper than I expected. It echoed longer than it should have. I didn't sleep much that night. 2 mornings later, I woke to find Owen already dressed. He stood by the back door with his flashlight in one hand, the other hung loosely at his side. He didn't turn around when I entered the room. "I think you should come with me," he said, his voice unwavering and full of conviction. He sounded like someone ordered to deliver a message they didn't fully understand. I told him to wait, stepped into my shoes, and pulled the camera from the drawer. I didn't know what I expected to see. Maybe nothing. Maybe just a shadow in the trees I could blame on fog or sleep deprivation. But part of me already knew better. The woods behind the house had never felt threatening before. They weren't deep, just a narrow belt of pines and underbrush separating our backyard from the old drainage ditch beyond. But that morning, they seemed older than the land around them. Something about them struck me as sinister. We walked side by side at first. Then Owen moved ahead, his flashlight swinging in a loose arc. He didn't speak until we reached the line where grass gave way to root-choked dirt. There, he stopped. "He doesn't want me," he said quietly, just loud enough for me to hear. "He wants you." The words settled between us. It wasn't a warning or a threat. It was a fact. I raised the camera, though my hand had begun to shake. Owen stepped aside, just slightly, clearing my view of the narrow corridor between the trees. At first, there was nothing. Then, rapidly, something began to take shape. The trees seemed to shift around it, opening in a way that made space for it, as though they were used to its passage. A tall, unnaturally thin figure stood at the center, the same outline I remembered from the desert and from Owen's sketch. It didn't move, but its head tilted just enough to acknowledge the attention. Its eyes, those twin hollows, were fixed on me. They weren't blank. They were focused, ravenous. I didn't scream. I didn't run. I kept the camera raised, its lens pointed directly at the thing in the trees. But I didn't take a picture. Some instinct told me that doing so wouldn't capture it. It wouldn't expose it. It would only give it a new way in. Instead, I reached for Owen's hand, his fingers curled into mine without hesitation. Together, we slowly stepped back, my gaze never leaving the thing in the woods. It didn't follow, not physically at least. Something followed in the silence it left behind, however, haunting us long after we retreated. Something I don't think has ever truly moved on. When we reached the porch, I turned the lock carefully. Each click of the bolt felt final. Owen looked up at me with a thoughtful expression. "I don't think he'll come in," he said. "I don't either," I replied, praying I was right, and held my son tight. And we left it at that. That was Never Run, Never Scream by E.C. Danner, performed by yours truly, Malcolm Blackwood.
Generational trauma. The gift that keeps on giving, especially when the family motto is, "Don't move and don't make a sound."
And you know what, Otis? When the dog knows more than you do, listen to the dog.
Coming up next, we head to the Utah backcountry for a tale of mimicry, memory, and something that calls out from beneath the stone. In tonight's third story, a pair of explorers set up camp at the edge of Weller Ravine, a place where the maps go blank and the echoes don't quite behave. But when a voice calls for help from a hole in a rock, only one of them recognizes it. This is The Vale in Weller Ravine by Merrick Harker, performed by yours truly, Otis Jiry. Part 1. The gravel cracked beneath the tires of the rented Jeep as it slowed to a halt, dust rising in thick orange plumes that lingered in the still air before dissipating into the mid-afternoon glare. The sun was high over the rim of the ravine, a white-hot disk bleeding into an endless pale blue sky. The landscape around them sprawled outward in all directions, dry and brittle, a quilt of weathered sandstone and pale desert brush. Utah's backcountry didn't welcome visitors. It tolerated them with the same indifference as the sun bleaching bones in the scrub. Jason Delaney stepped out of the passenger side and stretched his legs, squinting toward the distant canyon lip. His pack thumped against his back as he shifted it into place, already regretting the trip. The dust clung to his boots, and the heat clawed at his neck despite the handkerchief tied beneath his collar. "Looks like Mortar had a baby with Death Valley," he muttered. From the driver's side, Coach Anders killed the engine and leaned forward on the steering wheel, nodding toward the ravine's edge. Trail's head's half a mile east, just past the petrified stumps. You'll see where the ground dips. Jason nodded, saying nothing, then turned as Myra Chen climbed out of the back seat, a ball of energy in cargo pants and a green sun hat. She hoisted her duffel and scanned the surrounding ridges with the practiced glee of someone who believed wonder lurked just beyond every rock. "This is the spot," she said, grinning. 3 forum sightings cross-referenced within a 5-mile radius, and last week someone caught a heat signature on a drone that just vanished, like mid-flight. No terrain block, no signal degradation, just gone. Jason rolled his eyes and adjusted the strap on his shoulder. Or it crashed, and the guy's too embarrassed to admit it. She gave him a sideways look, but let it slide, pulling out a small handheld recorder from her vest pocket and clipping it on. "Day 1, she said, speaking into it. "Subject location, Weller Ravine, unincorporated stretch near the Utah-Arizona border. Weather's dry, mid-80s. No wildlife observed yet. Local accounts mention strange auditory phenomenon, potential cryptid activity. We're setting up camp above a suspected fault break." Coach Anders stepped around to the back of the Jeep and handed Jason a rolled topographic map. The paper crackled as Jason unrolled it, studying the rough grid. He traced their current position with a gloved finger. There were elevation marks, old surveyor notations, and a faded penciled line indicating a crude trail into the ravine. No caves, no tunnels, no markings of interest. "I've hiked these canyons for 20 years, Anders said, his voice low and gravelly. "Never seen anything down there worth chasing. You'll find heat, rock, and if you're lucky, maybe a rattler sunning itself on your boot." Myra kept recording, undeterred. "No caves marked?" "None on record," Anders said. "But records don't mean much out here. Just don't go too deep after dusk. The stone plays tricks." Jason raised a brow. "What kind of tricks?" Anders gave him a long look, then turned back toward the Jeep. "The kind that make people forget which way is up." With that, he climbed back into the vehicle, muttering something under his breath that Jason didn't catch. The engine rumbled to life, and without further ceremony, Coach Anders backed up, spun the tires, and disappeared in a haze of sand and sunlight. Silence settled over the ravine. Jason glanced at Myra. She stood staring into the chasm, recorder still in hand, her smile slowly fading. "No birds," Jason said. "No bugs. No wind." Myra turned toward him and grinned again, though it was thinner this time. "Said you wanted quiet. Congratulations. You've found the deadest patch of desert in the state." They made camp beneath a slanted outcrop overlooking the ravine's eastern curve. The rock offered modest shade, and Myra pitched her tent with practiced ease, chatting to herself and her recorder as she described the terrain. Jason took longer, his hands clumsy with the unfamiliar gear, and sweat dampened his shirt before the sun began to dip below the ridge. The fire pit was shallow, the fuel scarce, and dinner was instant rice and lukewarm beans eaten from shared tin bowls. Jason sat cross-legged by the fire as twilight bled across the sky. Myra sat across from him, replaying her earlier recordings and noting timestamps, occasionally muttering to herself. "I'm telling you," she said, "this place is a node. Something feeds off this kind of silence." Jason scoffed. "Silence is just silence. You're trying to turn echo chambers into horror shows." She smiled but didn't argue. They spoke less as the fire died down. By the time darkness settled fully, the ravine below them had become a vast black mouth, gaping and soundless. Jason crawled into his tent sometime after 10, exhausted. The heat didn't let up. Sweat clung to his ribs and soaked into the nylon floor of the shelter. He dozed intermittently, drifting in and out of shallow, half-formed dreams. Then came the rustle. It was close, just beyond the tent wall. Jason sat up and held his breath. "Myra!" he called softly, but heard no reply. He unzipped the flap and peered into the dark. The dying embers of the fire threw just enough light to see Myra's tent 10 feet away, zipped and unmoving. No reply. Jason pulled on his boots and stepped outside, scanning the ridge. His eyes adjusted slowly, but the shadows felt unnatural, too thick for the thin light. He was about to return when something familiar softly spoke his name, with urgency. "Jason!" He turned toward the sound. It had come from just beyond the ridge's edge, down where the rock sloped into the black of the ravine. "Myra?" he called again, this time louder. There was a pause. Then the voice returned. "Jason, help!" Identical. Myra's exact inflection. The same breathy cadence, the same lilt on the second syllable. Jason felt the back of his neck go cold. He crossed to Myra's tent and unzipped it roughly. She sat inside, rubbing her eyes, squinting at the intrusion. "What the hell?" she mumbled. Jason stared at her wild-eyed. "You called me. Twice. I was asleep." He stepped back, suddenly unsure. Myra blinked and rubbed her face. "Are you okay?" He forced a smile, shaking his head. Yeah, sorry, must have been dreaming." He zipped her tent back up, walked to his own, and just sat inside the flap. He didn't sleep the rest of the night. Far below, the wind whispered across the canyon floor, and something else carried his name a final time. Part 2. The second morning came without fanfare. The desert sun returned with brutal efficiency, burning off the last of the night's thin chill before Jason could finish boiling water for coffee. He sat on an overturned stone slab near the edge of their campsite, eyes narrowed against the light, watching the shifting hues of the ravine as it was relit in full, merciless detail. The wind carried with it no birdsong, no insect chirp-ups, no whisper of movement from anything living, just dry gusts brushing against rocks. By 8, Myra was already charting coordinates and fiddling with her recorder, her enthusiasm undiminished by the silence that had robbed Jason of sleep. He watched her set up her camera rig across from a layered wall of sediment and chalk, describing each strata into her mic with a mix of scientific curiosity and cryptid speculation. Jason pulled the topographic map from his pack and spread it across his knees, comparing it against the digital data on his handheld. Didn't add up. He frowned and tapped through the elevation overlays, then squinted toward a distant ridge that ran along the ravine's northern curvature. A shallow depression there, barely visible from their angle, registered on his scanner as a disruption in the subsurface density. According to the official maps, it didn't exist. Neither did the low-frequency fissure lines he was now tracing with the stylus. He called to Myra, who approached with the recorder still running. "There's a subsurface anomaly out past the next ridge," he said. "No record of it here." He tapped the corner of the map. "This area should be solid limestone, but we got cavities running through it." Myra's eyes lit up. Could be sinkholes, or better, collapsed tunnels. Lava tubes, maybe? Could also be an error in the scanner. She grinned. Or a hiding place. They packed up and made the short hike northeast, climbing over slick rocks and sloping ledges until they reached the low ridge Jason had marked. From above, the depression appeared unremarkable, just a shallow pit overgrown with scraggly sagebrush and crumbling sandstone. But up close, Myra spotted the irregularity first. A vertical shaft, roughly 2 feet wide, nestled beneath a tangle of dead brush and flanked by lichen-splotched stones. Jason crouched beside it and swept the debris away with his gloves. The opening yawned downward at an angle, the edges jagged and discolored. There was no clear bottom, only shadows descending into a deeper shade of black. "Jesus," he said, leaning over slightly. "Could have stepped straight into it." Myra knelt beside him and dropped a small stone. They listened. 4 seconds passed, then click. A distant, sharp tap like that of a pebble hitting bone. Then came another sound, rising slowly from below, carried on some unseen draft. At first, it was unintelligible, a soft moan that echoed through the shaft in irregular intervals. Jason leaned closer, trying to distinguish tone from distortion. The sound swelled, then warped, and Myra's hand suddenly grabbed his arm. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. Jason blinked. "Yeah. Weird acoustics, might be airflow. It's a voice." He paused, tilting his head. The sound seemed to shift with their movement, the pitch flexing and rebounding against the walls of the shaft. It repeated, low, breathy, and drawn out. This time, Jason made out syllables. 2 words. "Help me." Myra went pale. "That's a kid." Jason pulled away, skeptical. "Could be a bobcat. They sound human sometimes. Or a fox. Screams like that carry weird out here." Myra shook her head slowly. "That wasn't a bobcat, that was a child. And," she hesitated, her eyes narrowing, "I swear, I just heard your voice." Jason laughed, though it didn't come out convincingly. Yeah, okay." "I'm serious," she said. "Right after the kid's voice, like it repeated something you said earlier while we were packing up." Jason stood and took a few steps back. He didn't like how the sound lingered. "Could be feedback," he said, "or a reverberation loop." Myra didn't respond right away. She just stared into the shaft, holding her recorder close to the opening as the voices continued, rising and falling, but never quite vanishing. Later, as they returned to camp, Jason found himself walking slower than usual, burdened not by the weight of his gear, but by a memory that hadn't surfaced in years. He was 11. His brother, Tommy, had just turned 9. They'd been hiking the back trails near Mount Hood with their father. Standard weekend outing, nothing dangerous. The trail split around a cluster of fallen timber, and Jason had taken one fork while Tommy, trailing behind, wandered the other. There had been no scream, no cry, only a quiet call muffled by the trees. "Jason!" He had turned, thinking Tommy was joking. "Jason, help me!" Jason had laughed then, lightly, playfully, thinking his little brother was playing some game in the underbrush. It hadn't occurred to him that the tone was wrong, too calm and measured. By the time their father circled back and they retraced their steps, Tommy was gone. They never found a trace. Now, standing over a nameless hole in a rock, Jason shuddered. He marked the location on his scanner, noting the coordinates and logging the acoustic anomaly, but he made no mention of voices. That night, the air over the ravine was colder than the night before. The fire burned low, and Myra sat cross-legged, reviewing the day's recordings with furrowed brows and distant eyes. Jason stayed silent, staring into the flames as they warped and twisted. A sound broke the silence just before midnight. A voice, rougher than Myra's and far more familiar, drifted down from the ridge above their camp. "Jason! Myra! Come on now!" Jason stiffened. Myra looked up sharply, her mouth slightly open. They both knew that voice, Coach Anders. Jason stood and scanned the ridge, but saw no movement. The fire hissed softly behind him as the second call came. "You two all right? You get what you needed?" Jason turned to Myra. "He hiked out this morning. No way he's still around." Myra grabbed her flashlight and took a step toward the edge of camp. "Maybe he stayed close. They thought we needed backup." Jason stepped in front of her. "No, something's wrong." "What if he came back?" "He didn't, not without the Jeep, and we didn't hear an engine." They waited, and the voice didn't come again. Myra looked past him into the dark. Sounded just like him. Jason nodded slowly. "Yeah, it did." But neither of them moved toward the sound again. Not that night. Part 3. Jason woke to the sound of zippers and metal clasps. Myra was already halfway into her climbing harness, laying out rope and fasteners in meticulous rows. Her recorder, always running, sat balanced on a flat rock nearby, blinking steadily. He rubbed sleep from his eyes, not bothering to hide the irritation in his voice. "You're not seriously going down there?" Myra didn't look up. "Of course I'm going. That's what we're here for." "No, what you're here for is cryptid fantasy nonsense. What I'm here for is geological data. And none of that requires lowering ourselves into an uncharted hole where people, if they existed, are crying out for help using our voices." She stood and clipped the final carabiner into place, then turned to face him. "We don't know what it is. Could be a reverb loop, like you said, or a weird cave echo. We won't know unless we get closer." Jason stared at her, incredulous. "You're gambling on the idea that the creepy mimicry just happens to be natural reverb?" "I'm not gambling, I'm investigating." She slung her rope over one shoulder. "You can stay here if you want, but I'm going." Jason hesitated, then sighed, began pulling on his boots. "You're going to get yourself killed if you go down there alone." "I wasn't planning on it," she said. The descent into the shaft was slow and cautious, the rope biting through Jason's gloves as he rappelled down to the angled slope behind Myra. The mouth of the shaft gave way to a tighter corridor, the rock pressing inward with uneven ridges that scraped their shoulders as they eased past. The daylight above vanished within the first 30 feet, replaced by the cool, artificial glow of their headlamps bouncing across pitted limestone and crumbling shale. The temperature dropped more sharply than Jason expected, and with it came a stillness so complete it made their breathing sound intrusive. The air had a faint mineral tang, tinged with the scent of rot buried deep in the stone. Myra looked ahead of him, adjusting the beam of her light. "This passage twists left. Looks like it widens up down there." Jason examined the walls as they moved. Thin gouges marked the stone in erratic patterns, some long and shallow, others deep and frayed at the edges. They crisscrossed in no discernible pattern, but they all pointed in the same general direction, upward. "These weren't made by tools," he said. "They look like claw marks." Myra stopped and examined one set closely. Could be erosion. Stone fractures weird sometimes. Jason didn't reply. He didn't believe it was erosion. The marks were too narrow and deliberate, as if hands, desperate hands, had tried to climb back toward the light and failed. They pressed forward another 20 yards, squeezing through the tight curve in a tunnel before emerging into a large chamber, large enough for both of them to stand fully. Jason tilted his head back and found the ceiling lost in shadow, supported by warped columns of fused stalactites and bulbous mineral growths that arched in from either side. In the far wall, an aperture formed naturally in the stone, a kind of archway that led into a darkness more complete than anything Jason had seen in his life. This was the absence of light, a gap so dense it seemed to resist the headlamps entirely, swallowing the beams at the threshold. Myra stepped closer and pointed a recorder into the dark. "You hear that?" Jason stopped walking. "No. Listen." He did. A breeze, faint and hollow, stirred through the chamber, but no whispers. Nothing intelligible. "I don't hear anything but wind," he said. "I hear voices," she replied, her tone lower now, almost reverent. "Not words exactly. More like—" She trailed off, straining toward the opening. "Like something is waiting to speak but doesn't know how." Jason moved beside her and aimed his light directly into the aperture. The black didn't yield. Myra took a step forward, raising her recorder again, but before she could say anything more, the device crackled. A static burst filled the chamber, followed by a voice so sudden and familiar that Jason recoiled. "Jason, come back!" It was a child's voice. Jason's mouth went dry. He took a step backward. "Turn that off." Myra glanced at the recorder, then back at him. "That wasn't me. That was— I know who that was." The recorder cracked again, and this time the voice repeated itself, slower now. The syllables stretched unnaturally, as if dragged across broken glass. "Jason, come back!" Jason reached out and snapped the device shut. "We're done. We're going back, now." Myra looked stunned. "Jason, wait. That could be— I said we're leaving." She opened her mouth to argue, but then stopped, her eyes fixing on something behind him. Her light beam caught movement across the natural arch. Jason turned just in time to see it. Something passed between the columns, a figure slipping along the stone like liquid shadow. It was the shape of a man, but decidedly inhuman. It was too thin, too tall. Its limbs hung at strange angles, its head cocked toward the sound of Myra's recorder, as if drawn to it. Jason barely registered it before it vanished into the dark. Myra whispered, "Did you see that?" He nodded slowly. "Yeah." "What the hell was that?" Jason backed away from the arch, his hand brushing against the rock wall for balance. "I don't know, but we're leaving, right now." Myra didn't argue again. They turned and retraced their steps in silence, the walls seeming to press closer now, the scratches catching their light with too much detail. The ascent took longer than the descent, their hands shaking as they climbed, every echo magnified, every creak of stone suggesting pursuit. But nothing followed them. Nothing reached from the shaft or screamed from below. Whatever had been watching them remained where it was. When they finally breached the surface, Jason pulled off his helmet and breathed deeply, his lungs desperate for the air above, and took in the afternoon sun. Myra emerged seconds later, her recorder silent in her hand. She said nothing. Jason didn't ask her to. They both sat for a long time on the edge of the ridge, staring at the mouth of the shaft, now just a dark eye in the earth, half covered again by windblown dirt and the casual indifference of the desert. Neither of them spoke for the rest of the day. Part 4. They returned to camp without exchanging a word, just as the sun was beginning its descent behind the western ridge. Jason collapsed onto a flat boulder, brushing the dust from his sleeves. Myra crouched at the edge of the fire pit, setting her recorder down beside her, with a force that nearly cracked the casing. She didn't speak. Her voice was drawn, eyes fixed on the dirt, like she could divine some hidden answer in the pattern of pebbles and ash. Jason watched her for a while and then broke the silence. "That thing down there, whatever it is, you still think this is just about curiosity?" Myra didn't respond. "I mean, what's the plan here, Myra? Post it online? Feed it to your followers like raw meat? Woman records Echo Monster in Utah Shaft. Is that the headline?" Her head lifted slowly, eyes narrowing. "You think I'm doing this for clicks?" she asked. "I think you want to be the first. You want proof. You want exposure. You've been treating this like a treasure hunt from the start. You don't know what you're talking about." Jason stood and paced near the fire pit, running a hand through his hair. "I know you heard a child's voice coming from the dark. I know you followed it like it was a goddamn fairy tale. And I know something was down there, something that shouldn't exist." Myra stood, her voice sharp. "You think I wanted to hear your voice on that recorder? You think I asked for that?" "I think you're reckless, and I think you don't understand what you've stirred up." She grabbed her flashlight and turned away from him. "And I think you're scared, which you should be, but don't take it out on me." Then she froze. From beyond the ridge came a sound, faint but unmistakable, of a voice calling from the ravine. "Help! Myra!" Jason's voice went dry. It was his voice, identical in every way. It sounded like him, precisely like him. Myra turned back, eyes wide. "Did you?" Jason shook his head slowly. "I didn't say anything." The voice called again, louder this time, edged with urgency. "Myra, I'm down here!" She took a step toward the sound, her flashlight trembling slightly in her grip. Jason caught her by the elbow. "Don't." Her eyes searched his face. "But it isn't me," he said firmly. "I'm right here." Myra pulled away. "If there's even a chance someone's hurt down there." "It knows our voices," Jason said. "It uses them." She stared into the dark, her jaw clenched. "I have to check, just in case." And then she was gone, turning sharply, slipping into the descending shadows at the edge of camp, the light from her flashlight flickering across stones as she moved down the ravine slope. Jason stood alone by the fire pit, fists clenched at his side, helpless to stop her. He waited for what felt like 20 minutes, pacing the camp's perimeter and watching the place where light had last vanished. The sun had dropped completely now, leaving the ravine drenched in shadow, the firelight behind him barely pushing back the dark. Then the scream came. It was short, sharper than any sound she had made before, cut off halfway. Jason grabbed his light and ran. The ravine was a web of crumbling ledges and gravel slopes, but he found a path down quickly, calling Myra's name with every breath. No response. He reached a clearing near the base of the slope where broken slabs of stone jutted upward like crooked teeth. Her pack lay discarded at the center, along with a single trekking pole and the recorder. No sign of her. Jason dropped to his knees beside the recorder, pressing the playback button. It clicked on. "Jason!" Myra's voice shouted sharp and panicked. Then, "Myra!" Jason's own voice, echoing back. The two names repeated, overlapping, first normally, then distorted. The syllables stretched and reversed, mashed together and looped, like a child with a toy it didn't understand, but refused to let go of. "Myra! Myra! Jason! Myra! Jason!" Jason dropped the device, scanning the rocks around him. That was when he heard the footsteps, crunching lightly against the gravel. But there was no one visible, just the sound of something circling him in the dark. He turned in slow increments, sweeping the flashlight in all directions. The beam caught empty brush, cracked stones, and fragments of gear strewn carelessly. The footsteps continued, pacing closer. Jason backed away from the center of the clearing, stumbling as his boot struck a rut in the stone. He braced himself against a rock and shone the light upward, catching nothing but the night. Then the sound stopped. He waited, every muscle tensed. Silence so complete it felt like the world had been paused. From behind him there came a whisper. Jason bolted. He climbed the slope in a rush, fingers digging into the dirt, boots slipping on loose gravel. He didn't stop until he crested the rise and nearly collapsed into the remnants of their camp. The fire was gone, but a new light flickered at the far end of the clearing. A lantern. Coach Anders sat beside it, his face drawn and pale, the bags under his eyes deeper than Jason remembered. Jason stumbled forward. "You came back." Anders nodded once. I didn't like how it felt. I turned around before I got 10 miles out. Jason tried to speak but found his throat dry. He gestured behind him instead. "She's gone," he said. "Something's down there. It took her." Anders didn't ask for details. He simply adjusted the lantern and motioned for Jason to sit. "Ever heard him too? Off and on for years," he said quietly. "Usually from deep in the canyon, but sometimes near the caves north of here. Always calling someone's name." Jason stared at him, throat still tight. "You knew something was out here." "I suspected," Anders said. "Locals talk about it. Navajo didn't name it, but they wouldn't go near the lower ravines after dark. Said the stones remembers voices. Said something listens, learns them, waits." Jason looked down at the recorder, still clutched in his hand. It was silent now, but the screen blinked like it was still running, like it hadn't stopped since Myra disappeared. "I think it heard us," Jason said. Anders didn't speak for a long time. When he finally did, it was quieter than usual. "I think it always does." Part 5. The lantern's light held back the dark for only a few feet, and even that felt temporary, as though the shadows were waiting for an excuse to press in closer. Jason sat cross-legged beside the flame, shoulders hunched, the biting cold deeper into his jacket than the fire could counter. Anders remained silent beside him, watching the mouth of the ravine like something might rise from it if he blinked. When Jason finally spoke, his voice was hoarse. "I'm going back down." Anders didn't respond immediately. He reached into his coat, pulled out a battered radio, and checked the battery. "She's gone," he said flatly. Jason shook his head. "No body? No blood? No drag marks? That thing, whatever it is, uses voices. But maybe it doesn't kill. Maybe she's alive still, trapped and waiting." "You don't know that," Anders replied. Jason turned toward him, eyes sunken but focused. "No, but I can't leave without knowing." Anders stared into the flame a while longer, then stood and grabbed his pack. "You'll need help getting past that shaft." They returned to the shaft entrance just after dark. The sunlight reduced to a pale gleam behind the canyon's ridgeline. Jason stood at the edge of the drop, staring down into the darkness below, while Anders secured the rope with practiced movements. There were no echoes this time, no voices rising from the pit. Jason descended first. The rope creaked under his weight as he eased into the narrowing throat of the earth. His headlamp cut through only a narrow column of shadow, revealing the uneven grooves that still marked the walls, those desperate scratchings, preserved in stone. He didn't speak, not even to himself. Anders followed minutes later, his heavier frame shifting more cautiously through the tunnel's narrowing curves. They reached the wider chamber again without incident, the air colder and damper than Jason remembered. The natural arch still waited at the far end, unchanged. But something felt different. Jason stepped toward the arch, scanning the floor for any sign of Myra. Boot prints, cloth, gear, and there was nothing. Then a voice drifted in from behind. "Jason!" He turned, expecting Anders, but Anders was behind him, unmoving, frozen in place. The voice came again. This time it was Myra's. "Jason, help me!" He scanned the chamber. The voice had not come from the tunnel or the shaft, but from everywhere. Then another voice layered on top of hers, Jason's own. "Myra, where are you?" It was Jason's voice from the previous night. Exactly the same inflection and desperation, a perfect mimicry. Anders stepped forward. "Don't follow it, stay with me." Jason nodded, but his body was already drifting toward the archway. The darkness beyond it still swallowed the beam from his lamp, just as before. He inched forward, fighting the growing urge to cross the threshold. Then Anders' radio crackled to life at his belt. From out of the static, Anders' voice emerged, raspy and halting. "Go back! Go back! Go back!" Jason turned horrified. Anders was gone. Only the dangling rope remained, swinging ever so slightly above the tunnel entrance. The radio repeated the phrase again, a little slower, the syllables beginning to slur together unnaturally. "Go back!" Jason grabbed the radio and shut it off. The chamber was now completely still, the only sound the drip of water from somewhere above. He turned back to the arch. There, crouched in the crevice of the far wall, was the listener. At first he thought it was a trick of the light, something skeletal tangled in vines, but as his headlamp fixed on it, the shape resolved. It was gaunt, its elongated limbs pressed against stone. Its skin was the color of dried mud stretched too tightly over its bones. As he watched, its head turned toward him without a sound, its jaw hanging loose, its mouth agape. From deep within its chest came a fluttering, trembling sound, as though its voice box were strung like an instrument, twitching in preparation. Then it spoke. Not in words, not at first. The sound began as a low humming, layered atonal, like wind in a broken flute. Then syllables formed, coalescing around a breath that didn't come from lungs. "Jason, help me!" It was Myra's voice. The creature didn't move, it didn't advance or flinch beneath the light. It simply crouched, tilted toward him, and listened. Its jaw flexed once, shuddering as the next sound emerged. "Where are you, Myra?" It was Jason's own voice again, played back like a recording. He stepped closer, slowly. The beam of his headlamp never wavered from the creature's face. But it showed no reaction. For a brief moment he wondered if it was blind. He took another step. The creature remained perfectly still. Then Jason blinked. In that blink, it vanished. There was no sound, no movement of air, or scrape of talons on stone. One moment it was there, and the next it wasn't. The crevice stood empty as though it had always been. Jason backed away slowly, his legs trembling, the weight of the cavern pressing in on him like a vice. He didn't call out, not once. Whatever this thing was, it didn't need to hear him again. It took him longer to climb out of the shaft than he remembered, his arms weak and hands clumsy with fear. When he finally reached the surface, the sunlight was brutal but welcome. There was no sign of Anders. Jason wandered the upper ravine for the better part of the day, calling out only once or twice, each time lower than the last, the sound of his own voice, now a betrayal. Eventually he found Anders. The man stood near a rock shelf half a mile from camp, staring at the sky as though he no longer understood what it was. His lips were moving, but no sound emerged. His radio was crushed beneath his boot. Jason spoke to him, asking him what happened, but Anders only stared, eyes empty, mouthing words in silence. He never spoke again. Part 6. Jason never filed a missing persons report. In his final transmission to the university field office, he submitted a trimmed version of the geological survey, clean, formal, and notably unremarkable. There were no mentions of subterranean chambers, acoustic anomalies, or inexplicable vertical shafts. Myra Chen's name appeared only once, in the equipment requisition log, listed as a third-party assistant, nothing else. When the departmental emails began to pile up, asking about scheduling follow-ups or requesting clarification on survey discrepancies, Jason responded with rote professionalism. By the end of the second week, the field study had been quietly archived, boxed and labeled, another line in a database of unfinished projects. He returned to Oregon 3 days later and moved back into his one-bedroom apartment just south of the University District, where the rain was frequent and forgettable, and the nights no longer echoed with the wind. He didn't tell anyone what happened. Not his advisor, not his sister, not the couple of friends who still bothered to ask why he'd been gone so long. Even when a university newsletter printed a brief note about the interrupted fieldwork in Utah, and Myra's absence sparked a minor concern among a fringe group of paranormal researchers online, Jason said nothing. He stayed off message boards. He stopped answering cryptid-related emails. Anders, when last Jason heard, had been admitted to a care facility in Provo. The intake form had listed post-traumatic stress and dissociative mutism as contributing diagnoses, though the orderlies were more inclined to say he was just broken in the head. Jason never visited. He doubted Anders would recognize him anyway. A full year passed. It was the first week of November when the package arrived. Jason had been asleep on the couch, wrapped in a wool blanket, the TV still glowing with the tail end of some late-night nature documentary. The knock at the door came swiftly, 2 raps, spaced apart like the caller wasn't sure whether they wanted to be heard. He sat up, confused by the hour, and glanced at the clock. 3:13 a.m. The hallway light was off. Outside, rain streaked the glass, and the sodium orange hue of the street lamp barely reached the landing beyond his door. He waited, hoping the moment would dissolve, that the knocking had been part of a dream. But then it came again. 2 soft knocks, then nothing. He stood and walked to the door. When he opened it, the hallway was empty. No one stood there. No sound came from the stairs, not even the distant shuffle of someone walking away. That's when he noticed the package, resting against the door frame. It was weathered, taped unevenly, the cardboard soft at the edges as though it had been left out in the rain far longer than the storm outside could account for. There was no label or return address and no stamps. His name, Jason Delaney, had been scrawled in faded marker across the top panel in shaky, uneven handwriting. He brought it inside without understanding why he didn't leave it on the porch. The tape peeled away in wet, curling strips. Inside the box was a layer of shredded paper, and beneath it, an object wrapped in what appeared to be a section of old thermal blanket. Jason unwrapped it with mounting dread. It was Myra's recorder, still intact, scratched along the edge where it had fallen near the ravine floor, and blinking red. He stared at it for a long time before pressing play. The speaker hissed softly. For a moment, all was still. Then a voice broke through the silence. "Don't leave me." It was his voice, soft and pleading. He staggered back, nearly dropping the device, and sat hard on the edge of the couch. The recorder whined again and then went silent. The blinking light continued. He set it on the table and stood, rubbing his face with both hands. And that was when he heard it. From the far corner of the room, where the shadows gathered most deeply beyond the floor lamp, something shifted. It wasn't a creak, nor the groan of old pipes or the whisper of wind under the sill. It was the faint, unmistakable sound of feathers dragging across carpet. Jason turned toward the sounds, eyes locked in the corner. There was nothing there. No shape or movement, no outline within the dark. But the sound came again, a faint, rasping pull against the fibers of the rug, then silence. He didn't sleep that night. Instead, he moved through the apartment with every light on, every closet open, every window checked and rechecked. He played the recording back twice more. It didn't change. It never advanced. It simply spoke the same 3 words, then waited. "Don't leave me." It never sounded like a plea. It sounded like a reminder. Jason no longer considers himself a man of science. He hasn't returned to the Ravine. He hasn't filed for another field grant. The maps and charts that once covered the walls of his office had been torn down or locked away in boxes, stacked against the doors of the spare room. He doesn't tell stories, not to friends, not to strangers. But sometimes, when he's walking alone at night or hears someone call his name on an empty trail, he remembers. He remembers the sound of his own voice in the dark. He remembers what it felt like to be watched by something ancient and patient, which had been utterly voiceless until it found him. He still doesn't believe in cryptids, not really, but he knows what he heard, and he knows it's still listening. And that was The Vale and Weller Ravine by Merrick Harker, performed by yours truly, Otis Jiry.
You ever hear your own voice echo back at you from a place you haven't been? That's not reverb. That's a red flag.
Myra was brave. Too brave. Some holes aren't meant to be explored, especially when they remember your name.
If you enjoyed tonight's journey through misty fields, repeating voices, and crossing points between realities, there's more waiting in the patrons area. Ad-free episodes, bonus tales, and exclusive horrors you won't hear anywhere else.
It's just $7.99 a month or less with a yearly plan, and it gives you full access to every story, every week, without a single interruption. You'll be helping indie horror thrive and keeping our campfire burning.
To join, visit simplyscarypodcast.com and click Patrons, or head straight to chillingtalesfordarknights.com to sign up. Come closer to the darkness, if you dare.
And from all of us here at Chilling Entertainment, thank you for listening and for your support.
If tonight's episode proved anything, it's this. The scariest things don't always chase you. Sometimes they wait. A figure behind the trees, a mimic in the canyon, a fence that hums like it remembers, a fog that follows you home.
Tonight was a reminder that some memories are buried for a reason. But horror doesn't stay buried. It lingers. In drawings, in whispers, in footsteps that stop just behind you.
If you haven't already, be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel, Chilling Tales for Dark Nights, and ring that bell so you never miss what waits in the shadows.
And if your nightmares want more company, join me over at Otis Jiry's Tales from Duskwood. New episodes drop every Wednesday on YouTube, Spotify, and wherever else you listen to your terrors.
We'd love to hear from you, too. Follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Let us know which story stuck with you, or which one you refuse to listen to again with the lights off.
And to the brilliant authors behind tonight's tales, thank you for reminding us what true horror is, the kind that follows.
Until next time, if a door won't stay shut, a shadow won't move right, or a voice calls your name in your own voice,
just remember, the ones that linger never left.
Sleep well, listeners.
If you can.
Thanks for listening. You've been listening to Scary Stories Told in the Dark, a production of Chilling Entertainment and the creative team at Chilling Tales for Dark Nights, and a proud member of the Simply Scary Podcasts network. Visit simplyscarypodcast.com today to learn more about our network and our other amazing storytelling programs. Tonight's program was hosted, and its featured stories performed by yours truly, Otis Jiry. Selected stories have been adapted with the kind permission of their respective authors. Original music provided by Luke Hodgkinson and Jesse Cornett. Sound design and final mixing and mastering provided by executive producer and director Craig Groshek. Program's artwork and logo by David Romero. If you're looking for some fresh tales on a daily basis while waiting for the next podcast, check out my YouTube channel, the Otis Jiry channel, and my extensive collection of narrated tales there. Simply search on YouTube by my name, and you'll find me. And don't forget to subscribe and press the bell notification icon to get my latest releases. Got a scary tale of your own that you'd like performed? I take submissions. Email it to me today at otis@simplyscarypodcast.com to have your terrifying tome considered for production in a future episode of this show. That's otis@simplyscarypodcast.com. If you've enjoyed what you heard on tonight's program and are joining us on your favorite podcast app, subscribe to us to be sure you never miss an episode, and leave a 5-star review and a comment. Your feedback means a lot to me. You can also follow Chilling Tales for Dark Nights and yours truly on Facebook to connect anytime and get the latest updates on this and other programs and my channel. If you're listening on the Chilling Tales for Dark Nights YouTube channel, do us a favor and hit the subscribe button and the bell notification icon for ctfdn as well to get more spooky tales from me and the crew and another episode of this program each and every Wednesday. And don't forget to hit that thumbs up button to tell us how we're doing and leave a kind word or a request. And don't forget to visit us at chillingtalesfordarknights.com and consider supporting the team by becoming a patron. In addition to helping us out, you'll get exclusive access to our audio archive and ad-free downloads of all your favorite stories, including those you've heard on this program. As for me, I'll be back next Wednesday with more terrifying tales to keep you up all night. But that's all right. Who needs sleep anyway?
Chilling Tales for Dark Nights.